these are notes for Biology Chapter 11, Heredity, Section 11.1, about traits. And so you can go ahead and take the notes yourself from the book if you would like, but if you follow along with my notes, you will have all the definitions you need. You'll have the additional notes that you need. They will be in Cornell style, and all you will need to do for yourself is to write the summary. So this is your best chance to get a good grade on these notes. If you're confident about Cornell style and you would like to read the book yourself, feel free to do that. So first vocabulary term is a trait. A trait is a characteristic that an organism can pass on to its offspring. So that would be something like its hair color. What type of eyes does it have? How big is it going to be? All those sorts of things are traits. Heredity. Heredity is a set of traits that an organism receives from its parents. So, traits are passed down. Heredity is the traits that you receive. Genetics. Genetics is the study of heredity. Number 4, a true breeding plant. It is a plant that will always produce offspring with the same form of a trait when it self-pollinates. So if you have a pea that has purple flowers and it produces offspring with itself, then it's going to have purple flowers. If you have a pea plant that has white flowers and it's a true breeding plant, it's always going to make plants with white flowers. Cross-pollination. When the pollen from one plant is used to fertilize another plant. So this is kind of like in the natural world when a bee lands on one flower, gets the pollen, flies over to another plant, and deposits that pollen. They will be cross-pollinated. In scientific investigations, you can take pollen from one plant with like a Q-tip or something, or even cut off the anthers altogether and use it to pollinate another plant with it. Number 6 is gene. A gene is a unit that determines traits. So we talked a little bit about genes with the study island from Chapter 10. Genes are the things that basically determines your traits, as it says above and in the definition. An allele is a different form of genes that are called alleles. So a gene might say, this chromosome on this gene is going to determine your hair color. The allele says your hair color will be brown, or black, or blonde, or red, or whatever other color it wants to make. Dominant allele. The dominant allele is the form of a gene that, when present, covers up the appearance of the recessive allele. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the notes, but basically, if you have people in your family where there's a lot of people with all the same color hair, and then suddenly you get like a cousin who has this weird hair color and you don't know where it came from, they probably had a recessive allele showing up, but everybody who has the same color probably has dominant alleles. So number 9 is recessive allele. The recessive allele is the form of a gene that is hidden when the dominant allele is present. Phenotype. It is the form of a trait that an organism displays. So that's where we actually see the allele. We see what it's trying to tell us. The genotype is the actual alleles of a gene an organism contains. So this would be what the DNA is telling us. Phenotype is what the DNA is showing us. All right, page 2. So the textbook talks about studying traits, and it thinks about looking at breeds of dogs. So like a breed of dog would be like a Chihuahua, or a Great Dane, or a Lab, or a Pug, or something like that. Those are all breeds of dog. There are over 150 dog breeds, but they're all the same one species, even though all of them look different. So genetics is the study of heredity. Ancient dog breeders were able to figure it out. They already figured out that you could mix dogs together and you can get a different type. But they thought that a large dog plus a small dog is always going to give you a medium dog. That is not always the case. So the next thing the book talks about is a guy named Gregor Mendel. So let me skip down right there. So we're going to talk about him in a minute, but I copied the diagram first because diagrams are always important to include in your notes. So it has a diagram that shows a purple flowered pea plant crossed with a white flower pea plant. So they cross-pollinated these two. And what they found was all of the plants that came out had purple flowers. But then they took these purple flower plants and mixed them all together, cross-pollinated them, and they came up with a lot of purple flowers and some, or just one, with the white flowers. So that was something kind of weird, and this guy called Gregor Mendel, he thought he would look into it and figure out what was going on. So he was an Austrian monk, not Australian, Austrian. They call him the father of genetics. He was alive from 1822 until 1884. His discoveries were actually ignored until the 1900s. He bred pea plants to make discoveries about inheritance. But why did he do that? Well, he worked in a garden and he made observations that some plants' traits did not show up in offspring, but they instead showed up in the second generation. So instead of, like the first plant, it gets cross-pollinated or true bred pollinated, and the plants that it creates look kind of like the parents. They don't show everything until it skips a generation. So he decided to investigate this phenomenon by breeding peas. Why did he pick peas? Because they're quick growing, they're easy to breed, and they are flowering plants. Alright, so how did he do his experiment? He first started by studying pea plants and finding traits that have only two forms. So he didn't just start breeding these pea plants and guessing. He actually looked at pea plants, figured out what they actually have, and he noticed that flowers can either be white or purple. He noticed that they had seed shapes, which were either nice and smooth and round, or they could be all wrinkly. He noticed that the seed color could be green or it could be yellow, and the pod color could be green or yellow. So he had a either or, single choice. You get this or you get that. You get this or you get that. He didn't bother with blue flowers or pink flowers or yellow flowers or any other colors. He just found pea plants that had only purple or only white, only green or only yellow seeds, only green or yellow pods, only smooth seeds or wrinkled seeds. No in-betweens, only the extremes. So he set up his experiment. He decided to use true breeding plants because he knew the traits weren't mixed. So again, the true breeding plants are plants where if they pollinate themselves, they will always make, not necessarily clones, but plants that are the same. So we took two of those, one from each type, so a purple flower and a white flower type, and he crossed them, or he bred two different true breeding plants with different forms of the same trait. It's purple flowers, white flowers, green seeds, yellow seeds, green pods, yellow pods. He mixed them, he bred them together. So in the first generation, so that's the first set of baby seeds, is that what we want to call them today? So the first generation of flowers, they were all purple. Purple flowers, but they were mixed with white flowers, and they only made plants with purple flowers. Sorry, that sounded weird. Similar results for the other trials or other traits in G1. So he mixed maybe the green seeds and the yellow seeds, and he only came up with maybe green seeds. Kind of the same thing for everything he tried. So then he moved on to the second generation. So he took these plants right here, and he bred those together. So he allowed the first generation plants to self-pollinate. When he observed the results of that, the purple flowers self-pollinated, and they produced some plants that had white flowers. So purple flower plant plus purple flowered plant came up with a white flowered plant. That's some craziness right there, right? So he tried to figure out what was going on. He took his data and he calculated ratios. So in the second generation, with all the plants that he went through, must have been 929, so about 930 plants. 705 of them had purple flowers. 224 of them had white flowers. So he took the ratio. 750 purple to 224 white, which we can write as a fraction. 705 over 224. And then he reduced that fraction. So the book is saying to divide the top and bottom both by that 224. Basically, we're just trying to get the bottom of the fraction equal to 1. So 705 divided by 224 equals 3.15. And then we just put it over 1. Then they rounded it off to about 3 to 1, just because that's easier. So his conclusion, the results were similar for all second generations. So second generation of the flower color, second generation of the seed shape, second generation of the seed color, second generation of the pod color, they all got a very similar ratio of green to yellows, whites to purples, smooth to wrinkleds. So it proved that not all traits blend. If they blended, he might have gotten some pink flowers. He might have gotten some like yellow-green seeds. He might have gotten some seeds that were kind of smooth but had a couple wrinkles in them. But no, it was still the extremes. It was either white or purple. It was either green or yellow. No in between. So the traits that Mendel studied must have two forms of the same gene. One of them is dominant, like purple flowers, and the other is recessive, like the white flowers. So this brings us to phenotype and genotype. So the phenotype is the form of the trait that is displayed. So do we see purple flowers or white flowers? What we can actually see, what we can actually observe, that is our phenotype. The genotype is the alleles of a gene that the organism contains. So this is like the actual deep down inside. This is its DNA. I don't know about you, but I cannot see DNA just by looking with my bare eyes. So I cannot see a genotype. But I can figure out what a genotype is if I'm given enough information. So purple flowers could have both genes for purple or white, or they could just have genes for purple. That will determine the genotype. So how do we represent genes when we're talking about them for scientific purposes? We can use upper and lowercase letters to symbolize the alleles of a gene. We use an uppercase letter to represent the dominant. So for example, we might use a capital P to represent purple flowers. And then we use a lowercase letter to represent the recessive gene. So we might use a lowercase p to represent white. But wait a minute, P is for purple. Shouldn't I use W for white? No, that's not how it works. So I have a Wriggle pro tip here. Whoop, 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 air horns. So even if they represent different words, the same letter is used for a single trait. So we don't use capital P and lowercase w for purple and white. We only use capital P and lowercase p. So capital P for the dominant trait purple, lowercase p for the recessive white. So for 8th grade biology, we're normally going to be talking about complete dominance, where the dominant is the one we see, the recessive is the one we don't see unless we have a pair of the same. So as long as at least one dominant allele is present, the plant will show the dominant phenotype. And I have 3 examples of a phenotype and genotype. So if I have a genotype of a capital P, that would mean that I have 2 dominant alleles for the purple color. What would I see? Well, I have a capital P in there, so I'm going to see purple flowers. The next one, if my genotype is capital P, lowercase p, I have 1 dominant for purple and 1 recessive for white. What am I going to see? I have a capital P. That means my dominant purple is going to show. So I would see purple flowers. And if I have genotype lowercase p, then I have 2 recessive genes for white. I have no capital P's, I have no purples. So my phenotype, what I'm actually going to see, is white flowers. So that was pretty quick. It took me about an hour to write these notes, 15 minutes to read them to you. So please feel free to pause, rewind, go back, watch this over again. And then when you're done, write a summary. Your summary needs to be 2 to 3 sentences or a paragraph about the main idea of these notes.